So it's time now. Share a few more remarks from me. So yesterday, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, I talked about the idea of loss and grief. And I talked about the need for us to start to accept and process and grieve the losses of our time. I focused mostly on losses from the pandemic, which are many. It has taken years from our lives, impacted our children's learning and social skills, has impacted everyone's mental health. Some of our members are still shut in their homes for fear of infection, and they are struggling with isolation. For those of us who are back out there, life is still often frustrating because things are not quite the same as before. For example, having to wear masks in our sanctuary. I know there are a number of us who are very frustrated with that, and I get it. I get it. For those who are here in person in our synagogue, I'm hearing many of you say how wonderful it is to be back gathering in the congregation, and how wonderful it is to be able to see people in 3D, as I call it, but also that we miss everyone who is not here with us in person, right? We've got, what is it now? We've got 25 screens on Zoom. Folks that are not here, they're there, right? And we miss them. Things have changed so much from what they were. They have changed, and it's time for us to start acknowledging that. So I also talked a little bit about processing other losses as well, but I want to say in terms of acknowledging this loss, there was an article, I don't know, maybe it was about 6 months ago from the New York Times talking about how we needed to grieve, start grieving these losses, and we needed to accept that things weren't going to ever go back to the way they were before. And I was like, nah, nah, I cannot read this now. And I put the article away. I wasn't ready to hear it then. I think now it is time for us to start talking about it as we're starting to try to pull through the pandemic and try to think of what things are going to be looking like as we go forward. I think we also need to acknowledge that some things, are not going to be able to come back. So I also talked a little bit about processing other losses that I'm also going to talk a little bit more about here. At the same time that we were pulling through the pandemic, we at Adat Re'im also transitioned from a 29-year rabbi over to me, yours truly, your first ever female rabbi. It's a big change. And as great a rabbi as I may be, it's still a very big change for our congregation. And that means that there is also loss that must be accepted and grieved as well. And I know some of you are really feeling this. Even so now, still 2 years later, some of you are really feeling this, and I get that. And I think it's worth naming that's also out there right now. And some things have already changed through the rabbinic transition, and other things will also need to change going forward, even as we work together to maintain our beloved traditions and to try to keep the same feel of Adat Re'im synagogue life, which I know we all care about very deeply, me as much as anyone. So as we work through this transition, I know that some of us are still struggling with that grief, which, given the fact that Rabbi Aft's tenure spanned more than a generation, is very understandable. And it takes time. But I think it's also important for us to name that that's also there. And we're also processing that along with the losses of the pandemic. On top of this, there are also other losses. There is the deterioration of our society and political culture into divisiveness and even violence that now even threatens our democratic system of government. This is especially painful for congregations such as ours in the DMV, where many of our congregants serve in government and the military and have dedicated their lives to serving and protecting our nation and its democratic system. It's painful. And if all that wasn't enough, we're also dealing with rising awareness that climate change is altering the world that we live in. There's a major hurricane heading up the East Coast, heading towards the East Coast as we speak. Probably we're going to get at least some of it. And it's altering the world that we live in, perhaps permanently, for the rest of our lives. And there are losses there that must be processed also. And these things are hard. So any one of these things is already a lot. But if you take them all together, it's overwhelming. And that causes some big emotions: fear, anger, frustration, despair. And I was talking a little bit about some of that yesterday. And I suggested that we look to the Jewish value of community to find solace and comfort and to help each other to process these challenging times. And that we could make it through if we banded together, if we looked out for each other and challenged the sense of entitlement, even sometimes, and individualism that we all carry. So today, I'm going to share some Jewish texts to add some support to this idea, but also to interrogate it a little bit about exactly what community means and what are the boundaries of community and what does it mean. And for this, I'm turning to two Israeli authors who arose in the post-Holocaust world. And it's important, I think, that that be the case, because that was also, of course, a trauma in our lives that occasioned great loss in the Jewish community, in the Jewish imagination, and the Jewish understanding. The first of these two authors is Shalom Noach Berezovsky, a Holocaust refugee from Belarus who landed in Israel, and he became one of the leading rabbinical scholars to rescue and to help us preserve the brilliance and emotional depth and spiritual depth of Hasidic Judaism in the 20th century. And it was especially important because the Holocaust wiped out much of that scholarship and many of those scholars. But Shalom Noach Berezovsky survived and really did much to bring Hasidic Judaism and the power of Hasidic Judaism back into the 20th century in a post-Holocaust world. And the second scholar that I'm going to be sharing is Tamar Biala. And she's a contemporary scholar of our times today. And she has led a movement to rescue and to also help us preserve women's midrash, specifically midrash meaning interpretations of the Torah. And her movement of preserving women's midrash and cataloging women's midrash, that's unfolding right now as we speak. Biala finished editing her second volume of women's midrashim in 2018. And it just came out in English in June, like brand new. So these two offer some both of them offer some important views on recovery after the Holocaust, different views that I hope can offer us some wisdom on how we can work together to recover from the trauma and loss of our times. And of course, the midrash that was written in 2018, of course, didn't have the pandemic in it, didn't have a lot of the things that we're dealing with now. So she was really referring back to the Holocaust and a post-Holocaust world. But we, I'm hoping, can use some of this wisdom for us right now. Very interestingly, both of them, very different biblical scholars, use the biblical story of Noah and the ark and the flood to make their points. Also a story, of course, of trauma and loss. So Berezovsky, who is best known for his book of commentaries called Netivot Shalom, he talks at length in that work about the need for us to build an ark, to protect us and to shelter us and to comfort us in times of chaos and even the spread of evil. He has several essays on what constitutes an ark. The first one he names Torah as a prophylactic against the corruption of the generation of the flood. He talks a lot about corruption, he uses that word specifically. And a prophylactic against the corruption of the generation of the flood, in which we can rise up to God. Then second, he names the practice of Shabbat as a shelter, as a refuge, a place where we can bring our pain and to find solace and also as a source of renewal for our spirits. And third, besides Torah and Shabbat, he also discusses the power of spiritual community. And he writes the following. He says, when people of good character get together, this gathering produces good things, even if they do not do anything else. The simple unity of good people strengthens the forces of good. This is the nature of the ark, in which all the pure are gathered in one place, and the power of their unity saved them. The power of their unity saved them. This is the force that strengthens us. The response of our evil inclinations will be to grow stronger, and it will challenge such unity. But the power of our salvation lies in our connection with each other and with people of good character. Spiritual community is a refuge from the storm. However, he also warns that community can become corrupted, just like anything else out there. And he writes, the simple unity of good people strengthens the forces of good. But this is also true in the opposite. When people of a negative character gather, this will produce negative consequences. This is what happened with the generation of the Tower of Babel, another biblical story. The Blessed Holy One, who knows the inner workings of our hearts, saw that this was a joining together of people of negative character, from whom might extend the awful corruption in creation. And that is why God dispersed them around the world. And so I think he raises some really important questions. How do we keep our communities whole and safe in these times of pain, of grief, of despair, in these very, very vulnerable times that we live in? And another question, who is responsible for engaging any corruption of the community that emerges during such vulnerable times? Is it any one member? Is it all members? Is it everyone together? Or is it perhaps, as Berezovsky seems to allude, in my interpretation, that it may only be God who can remove any evil or corruption from our midst in actuality? And these are some big questions as we face all of the strife in our world today. Who is responsible? So next, Tamar Biala. She raises different concerns, as feminist midrash often does. And for Biala, the concern is, what do we do with those people who have exited the ark after the flood, but cannot get over the flood? What do we do with the people who have exited the ark after the flood, but still cannot get over the flood? Her midrash is an allegory based on the raven and the dove. For those who know the story of Noah, Noah releases a raven and a dove to find out if there is dry land. And when the raven and the dove don't come back, that's how Noah knows that it's time to start preparing to exit out of the ark. And he knows that they can all then leave the ark. So when the land dries and they all exit the ark and life begins again, but not the raven or the dove, who are never mentioned again. And so Tamar Biala asks what happened to the raven and the dove, and this is her midrash, is the answer to that question. So her allegory starts with a house of study made up of birds. So there are birds in a house of study. They're studying together, and they're reading the Torah, reading the story of Noah, and they're saying, hey, what happened to this raven and this dove? Because we don't ever see from them again. And so they seek to find both of these birds, and they find the dove, who seems to have reintegrated into society, But the dove has also spent all the time since the flood compulsively giving birth to new children. And she is miserable and utterly exhausting herself by just giving birth and giving birth and giving birth, obsessively creating life in the face of the death and the harm that is caused by the flood. Now, it is much harder for them to find the raven, because the raven, on the other hand, is not gone back. It's actually flying in the air around and around and around, too afraid to trust the earth to land on it again, and also too disgusted by the death and harm and corruption that has unfolded there to be able to go back. These are two responses to the trauma and the loss of the Holocaust. But I think that they can also apply as responses to the trauma and loss of our times. Now, the dove's response looked normal, but it involved obsessive levels of activity, traveling all over, trying to bring back all the things that were lost, even though she, the dove, must have known deep down inside that some of what was lost could never be recovered. The raven's response, on the other hand, was dropping out, never fully reintegrating back into society out of fear, but also out of disgust for the world and distrust of what might happen if we actually trusted the earth again to hold all the creatures and all the people. So what did the birds do in this story when they found the raven and the dove? In Biala's Midrash, they praised the dove and they neglected to see how the dove was harming itself. And the birds criticized the raven and, pointing to everything that the dove was accomplishing, tried to shame the raven into returning back to society. But the raven wouldn't budge. And the story only ends when the birds call on the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah being the female spirit of God that the mystics say dwells among us at all times. The Shekhinah comes, scolds the birds for shaming the raven and for ignoring the pain and the trauma of the dove. The Shekhinah then embraces the raven and the dove and allows them both to rest. And they both die in the Shekhinah's arms. And that's the end of that story. It's very deep and powerful. And I think it has a lot to say. Community is great. The birds were having a great time in their house of study, and it is a shelter to many. But I think it raises some questions as well about what is our responsibility to our members. What is a community's responsibility to its own members as they process loss and trauma, either inside or outside of community? To what extent are we, any of us, driven by responses like the dove, of obsessively creating activity to recoup our losses, to get back what we wanted back, and not recognizing that action like that will not bring back the past that we lost, only just more likely going to make us miserable instead? And to what extent do we, any of us, seek to normalize that behavior and praise it and reward it, missing the harm that is also being created underneath as we set impossible standards for ourselves and for others, as others point to those people who are seemingly doing awesome and doing everything, but probably also struggling with the loss, because it's still there. On the other hand, what is our responsibility to look after those people whose responses are more like the raven? People who have withdrawn from community out of fear of pain, fear of infection, in the case of the pandemic, and who may never be able to trust things enough to come back. What judgment do we, as a community, carry for those people? Is there some way for us to recognize their difficulties, to see them in their pain, and offer them other ways to connect with us that may not entail walking back into institutional life just yet? And what is our responsibility to do so? And I say this to a room of people who clearly are getting back out again and are trusting institutional life and here with us, and that's great. But I also say this to a group of folks on Zoom who have chosen that path instead. So I offer these questions for us to consider as we move forward in our society's recovery from all of these difficulties. And I think all of these things are going to be playing out in different ways at different times, sort of different pace over time, but we're going to be dealing with all of it. But also thinking about our congregation's recovery and our transitions. Thinking about how we, any of us, can rely on community embracing us and sheltering us in these troubled and vulnerable times. This is still a vulnerable time, but also the very real risks and dangers that I think both of these authors, both of these scholars, I think rightfully point out could be an issue. So I'll end by saying that as our spiritual leader, as your rabbi, I care very deeply about how all of you are handling what's unfolding here and what's going on in your life around these things. Your concerns, your fears, your pain, the things that you're holding, the things that you refuse to hold. It's all there. It's all there, right? I care about us being able to see each other wherever we are, wherever we may find ourselves. I care about us recognizing when we need support, to find comfort, to find ways back into things that we aren't sure we can find our ways back into, to take that risk. I talked to a couple of people just yesterday who were saying that they weren't sure if they were going to come into the sanctuary for services, but they did in the end, and how they were feeling about having done that. People are going to have different feelings about things. And how are we going to hold those reactions? I'm also here to help us raise some of these questions that I think are important ones for right now. To help challenge us about how we're looking out for each other, and also how we're looking out for the quality of our community. The good that our community does, and when there are harms, to take responsibility for the harms that are done as well. And I'm also here to help us reflect on any of it, all of it, and to go forward into that new year, starting to think about what we need, in order to start answering some of those questions together with a lot of care, a lot of respect, a lot of love, a lot of friendship in our community of friends. and where that may be needed. So I wish you good New Year, Shana Tova. Thanks for listening. Shana Tova. So I'm just going to let that sit a minute. So friends, it is my pleasure to invite forward now Stuart Hill. He's going to be leading our shofar service. We're going to be having next. The shofar, I think, is a really powerful way to follow up on some of the themes we were just talking about. It's about listening. It's about waking up. It's about revelation. We're going to be on page 248. And I am going to invite us first to read responsively on page 248. For untold generations on this day, our ancestors listened to the sound of the shofar. What did they hear in its piercing tones? What solemn truths did they detect in its calls, which stirred them so profoundly each year? Tekiah, awake. Nope, not yet. I knew that was going to happen if I called it out like that. Okay. Let not habit dull your minds, nor comfort, nor harden your hearts. Examine your deeds, look well into your soul, mend your ways, turn to God. Shivarim, the broken refrain. Listen to the staccato cry. Hear the echoes of sighing and weeping. The deprived and the distressed, the neglected and the enslaved, the bruised and the broken, all crying out for relief from their pain, for release from their torment. Teruah, the call to battle is sounded. Join in the struggle against evil and suffering. Give of your bread to those who hunger. Give of your strength to those who stumble. Give of your time to the lonely and the forsaken. Heal the wounded and comfort the bereaved.